First of all, I just got a call saying that it's been announced that it is a real draft, but it doesn't represent who's going to vote for it yet.
Women's rights in America are under attack. If the court overturns Roe v. Wade, it will be a direct assault on freedom.
Welcome to the Black Table. We're here once more to have a conversation about the issues that affect us in the contemporary world through a lens that elevates the opinions, the varied debates, and the consensus of Black communities, not only in the United States, but around the world. I'm your host, Greg Carr, here on the Black Star Network. And today we are going to have a conversation about the leaked draft opinion in Thomas E. Dobbs, State Health Officer of the Mississippi Department of Health, et al. Versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. The draft opinion for a decision that everyone has been expecting to be released in June of this year, which may very likely strike down Roe versus Wade and the Casey Planned Parenthood case. Of course, those cases have to do with the right of a woman, maybe a right that is about to be taken away, to make a decision to terminate a pregnancy, the abortion cases. In the United States, as it stands, however, we know that the abortion rate is at its lowest since the 1973 Roe decision. And we know that that has more to do with fewer pregnancies in this country. So why is this leaked opinion and why is this conversation so arresting, and why has it seized the public imagination and fired all types of political statements on all sides of the spectrum? So we've asked our legal roundtable to convene today to have this conversation. So we're being joined again by Georgetown Law Fellow and incoming Assistant Professor of Law at the American University, Angela Porter, and Professor Alethea Watkins, Professor of African American Studies and Director of the Women's Studies Certificate Program at Howard University. Welcome back, professors, to this conversation.
Good to join you.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Well, let's start. Well, I suppose we could say we could start at the beginning. There's been a 5-decade plus war for control of the federal bench, particularly the Supreme Court, and looks like the numbers are there now to overturn Roe. In our second segment, we're going to get into the Dobbs draft and see what we're talking about in terms of the particulars. But I guess what I want to really open with is asking you your thoughts on the context for the conversation we've been having over the last week. What do you think about this? I mean, there's a leak. This is not without precedent, complete precedent, but it's certainly so very rare that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has decided that rather than investigate Jenny Thomas and Clarence Thomas, he's got he's shocked to find these kind of things are going on his watch. But could you talk to us a little bit about what you think about the context? Either of you can start of this leak and the implications.
Well, I would just start with, if we're going to talk about the implications of the leak, we're witnessing one of the first time we're having a federal constitutional right being revoked, the ending of federal protection of a constitutional right, the shifting of this right from the status of, from the Constitution to a lower status of a political privilege that will be subject to the whims of politicians and their political motives. And this will have an extremely negative impact on, or a greater impact on Black women. Because for Black women and other women without resources, Indigenous women, brown women, what we will have if this court strikes down Roe is access to safe and legal abortion medical care will become separate and unequal. And since the court is fond of well, I don't want to get into the draft yet, but it's very trolling to always evoke Plessy versus Ferguson, the overturning of Plessy, to justify really overthrowing stare decisis, a long precedent, only to introduce on the other side separate but equal access to a right and to a privilege. So it's going to have an extremely negative impact, adverse impact on Black women, particularly when we consider not only unequal access, but the unacceptably high maternal mortality rate that exists in this country. And it's going to weaken the right to privacy, which we'll get into, but it will reopen the door to back alley abortions, because abortion is not going to disappear, but it just means women without resources are going to be vulnerable to these, the potential loss of life due to not having access to this critical medical care.
Well, thank you, Professor Watkins. Professor Porter, it's interesting in the federal framework that we live in. We understand, even as in 2021, there are over 100 restrictions on abortion that were passed in various state legislatures, and there have been over 30 so far in 2022. We also, however, understand that the argument against against Roe, against Casey, has always been, well, let's just leave it to the states to decide. And we know that federalism is the framework in many ways that preserves the settler logic of the United States and its afterlives. I mean, legislative fixes are all well and good, but it guarantees white rule for the foreseeable future. The federal level, when you think about the power of legislatures in underpopulated states, which tend to be majority or overwhelmingly white, but is this a big deal? I mean, is it as big a deal as we are being told, particularly as Professor Watkins has just walked us through this, given the federal framework of the United States? I mean, is this not perhaps the best way to go? Leave it to the states?
So it makes sense in a true democracy to leave this decision to legislatures. The problem is we're not that. In the United States, this is not a true democracy because of voter suppression, because of gerrymandering, because of the concerted effort ever since the Civil War to ensure Black folks do not form a powerful voting bloc, regardless of the reality on the ground. So this is a big deal because there's some level of disingenuousness about the way this system practically functions. Now, I have to be clear that, the court is not saying it is banning abortion. You're absolutely right, Dr. Carr. It's saying the court system, the judiciary, should not be in the province of regulating the right of abortion because it's not in the Constitution. And I know we're going to get into this in a little more detail in a moment, but in theory, that makes kind of some sense because you have 9 justices to govern them all. You have 5 justices at that's the number of people who have signed on allegedly to this draft opinion, deciding the fate of the entire citizenry of the country. And so under this theory of judicial restraint, it makes sense for decisions that are not expressly related to the Constitution to be made by an electorate or the legislature, people that we vote into power. But as you just implied and identified, the voting system is broken, or it's working exactly as intended.
Right.
The voting system does not actually form a representative democracy. Those representatives are not representative because of redistricting. We saw some Supreme Court opinions earlier this year that validated these terrible redistricting decisions that said Black folks should not get another majority minority district in certain states like Wisconsin and Alabama. So what you now see is the judiciary acting as a co-conspirator to the electorate, which is trying to wrest and retain power that doesn't reflect representation. So,
well,
all of this just, it doesn't make sense on a practical level. It makes sense on a theoretical level.
That's very interesting you raised that, Prof, because I'm thinking about Dick Durbin when there was the struggle by the right to get Kavanaugh onto the DC Court of Appeals. And Dick Durbin at the time said of Kavanaugh, it seems like you are the Zelig or the Forrest Gump of Republican politics. You show up at every scene of the crime. We remember that Kavanaugh was there in Bush v. Gore. Kavanaugh was there pressing in some of these voter suppression cases. And of course, we know John Roberts cut his eye teeth under William Rehnquist, who also was involved in voter suppression. So when you put it in that context, and particularly since you had at least Kavanaugh, at least Comey Barrett, at least Gorsuch, all when testifying at their confirmation hearings saying that Roe was decided law, lying in the face of brilliant folk who can tease out those kind of things like Susan Collins, then come get on the court and look like they're lined up to vote to overturn Roe and Casey. But you're raising something very interesting. The majority of people polled in this country support safe abortion. Now, but their legal humanity means something different depending on the geography where they live. So I guess when you say that we're living and working in a system that is operating the way it was designed to operate, we'll probably talk about this more in the last section when we look forward. How do we manage in a system where the judiciary, and I'm thinking now about Samuel Moyn, who wrote an article in 2018 in Dissent magazine, "The Supreme Court is not your friend. The court is not your friend," where he says we probably over-relied on the courts. I remember I read Moyn's article and I laughed because I thought to myself, you're not black. I'm thinking about what Ralph Bunche said. He said, black people, in some ways, the Supreme Court, we're a special ward of the Supreme Court. Should we be looking to the court to intervene in moments when we definitely have, I guess, for lack of a better term, a standard for legal humanity in this country, which means everybody's not equal just depending on where you live in the country, since a majority support abortion, but that doesn't translate into policy.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I think, that's an important point. We need to connect the dots. People frame this as a war on women, but this is really a counter revolution on the civil rights revolution. That is really what this is. And we need to connect all of these things that have been happening. It's longstanding, but we need to connect. This is, the GOP wakes up every day. This is their question of the day: how to protect, defend, sustain their power and control over this nation and its institution. Indeed. So this is part of a larger strategy that, I'll truncate it in the interest of time, but certainly the collusion to steal 2 Supreme Court seats, the suppression of voting rights. And so that goes back to what Professor Porter was saying. When we look at this whole conversation about CRT, those are the distraction and the diversions that people are putting out there. So this attack on Roe is connected to this whole government strategy that the GOP has. And so should we look to the courts? We're different in the sense that we can't abandon any of the strategy. So his point of saying that we need to press these rights in the legislative branch, we need to press them in every branch. We need to press them because the courts are necessary to be just and fair. Because if you just do the legislative without the courts, then it's easy for them to overturn it. That's even right. If you pass the statute. So it's going to take a holistic approach, all of the above for us. We can't abandon any section of the playing field. But this is really a masterclass in white supremacy and how you abuse power. And that's what we're seeing. And the Roe versus Wade decision, Casey decision, the attempt to overturn it is not just directed at women, but when we look at the whole thing that is taking place, it is about weaponizing these issues as wedge issues to build political power.
Yes. Well, let's take a pause here, and we'll come back in a moment here at the Black Table, and we're going to get into the draft opinion of Samuel Alito in Dobbs versus the the Jackson Women's Health Organization. Back in a moment at the Black Table.
Put 10 in here?
10, and you don't come out till you die. And you eat him, you hoop 10.
Oh my God.
So
Welcome back to the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr, your host here on the Black Star Network, joined by our legal round table, Angela Porter and Valethia Watkins. And when we left, Professor Watkins, you had framed this quite brilliantly, I think, as really a conversation, and more than a conversation, a deliberate set of strategic political actions that are a response in many ways to the great social movement of the mid-20th century. By the white nationalists who have now populated the Republican Party. Let's look at this draft opinion, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Samuel Alito opens up, in fact, in that second footnote, I thought it was interesting. He quotes Professor Ely and talks about a very famous article where Ely, in critiquing the Roe decision in 1973, John Hart Ely, says that this decision is basically based on nothing. They made up a right. Can either of you walk us through the rationale that Alito kind of leads out with at the beginning of the opinion, where he says basically the Constitution makes no reference to abortion and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision? How can he say that? For folks who are saying, well, how can he say that? And all the law professors are just nodding like, yeah. Well, either of you, please. Professor Porter.
Yeah. We actually talked about this a little bit on the last show where we were discussing soon-to-be Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. We talked a little bit about how the court is going after this legal theory called substantive due process. And as Dr. Watkins so well put it in the last segment, this is their concerted strategy. This court is actually returning to its origins. The Warren Court of the 1960s that, created, some would argue, a lot of these rights, that was what is considered by a lot of jurists, a lot of law people, as an activist court. It was a constitutional revolution. Now, implicit in what I just said is that these rights were not always there. As most people recognize, the right to abortion begins with Roe. That's 50 years ago. So what was happening before that? And how did the court arrive to this decision? Well, it actually, and you see this in the draft, it goes back to an important moment in our history, the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. Before the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, remember the Confederate States were forced to ratify that in order to get representation in Congress after the war.
Yes.
That 14th Amendment was meant to protect newly freed, enslaved people, our people, Black people, from state violence, from the states taking away all of the citizenship rights that Black people had just gained through these amendments. So that was the 14th Amendment. It had several clauses. One of the clauses is called the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause.
Mm-hmm.
Ever since that time, the court has been, this is, you know, it goes back to things that help Black people help everybody. Okay. The court has been funneling through the 14th Amendment rights for everybody. And it was the first time that the court could say the states could not infringe on rights guaranteed by the Constitution. Before that, the Constitution was all about the federal government and how the federal government could not infringe on, say, your right to freedom of assembly, freedom of religion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the 14th Amendment incorporates these federal rights to the states. And ever since that time, the South have been trying to rise again. They do not like the federal government in their state business. That's been the story ever since. Now, substantive, I'll come back. I'll explain some more.
No, it was the attempt there, and I'm thinking now, of course, about Dred Scott, 1857. I mean, was the attempt of the 14th Amendment in some ways to address that kind of, it's interesting how so much of this is just judge-made law. I mean, Taney creates this citizenship of the United States and citizenship of the specific state you're in. He's almost making that up. And so in some ways, the 14th Amendment is recombining it. We have a 5th Amendment. And so, but I guess what I'm asking, interestingly enough, as you say, Alito opens this case, opens the draft. And when he quotes Ely's proposition is that unenumerated rights are procedural, not substantive. And so what is the difference between substantive due process and procedural due process? I'm trying to understand that, because Ely in that law review article does say that I agree with a woman's right to choose. I just think that the court cannot intervene in what should be legislative affairs. In fact, I would agree with Roe completely if it were a piece of legislation, but the role of the court is not to weigh in and create these substantive rights. So what are the source of these rights, these unenumerated rights that don't appear in the letter of the Constitution, but the courts have somehow interpreted, like privacy, and like privacy being the main one?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned 5th Amendment due process. That's a federal right. So the First Amendment, the 14th Amendment, is the first amendment that addresses what the states can't infringe upon. And so you have the one category of rights that the states can't mess with are the rights codified in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution, the express rights of the Constitution. First 10 amendments. Then you have what is called implied fundamental rights. Now, this is what the Warren Court started really leaning into in the 60s. They're looking at what rights people have that are not expressly referenced in the Constitution. And the way they come to the right to privacy is by looking at other amendments, things like soldiers can't quarter themselves in your house, plus the freedom of association. And they put these together. They say in the penumbras or in the shadows of the Constitution.
Explain to people, we're going to hear a lot about penumbra in the next few weeks. What is that penumbra? They pulling from the first and the fourth and the ninth, and they're what is a penumbra?
It's a shadow. It means a shadow. So it's just a rhetorical reference to, we're looking at the Constitution and we feel like there is an implied right to privacy.
Yes.
The spirit of the Constitution says privacy. And that's how they come to the right to abortion. They also draw from privacy to think about things like contraception. They look at a right to marriage. And all the while, they're coming up with rules for naming these implied rights. One of them being that the rights have to be deeply ingrained in the history and tradition of the United States, which actually goes back to history and tradition of English common law.
Well,
But
actually, before I mean, and Alito Marx lays this out. I mean, and like say any first year law student knows this, but for the general public listening to this conversation, there are two pillars in there. There are two sources, right? I mean, there's this penumbra where you're cobbling together, and then, as you say, there's the 14th Amendment, and the 14th. So how are you distinguishing between cobbling these things together? Because he ultimately, I guess, in Roe and Casey, they're drawing on the 14th Amendment. They're not necessarily, they make the penumbra argument, but that 14th Amendment just emerges so importantly. Why is that?
It's the same thing. So the 14th Amendment has a due process clause that applies to the states. And it says that the states cannot deprive life, liberty, and property, your rights to life, liberty, and property, absent due process. So they looked at the word liberty. And what is liberty? What does it mean? Mm-hmm. So implicit in liberty are all these other rights. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and not all of them, actually. And then the implied rights. So when we think of liberty,
there are a lot of rights that aren't in here.
Right. Yeah, the 9th Amendment does say that. Yeah, but the 9th Amendment argument hasn't really been well received.
No, they don't use
well
it.
Relied upon.
I mean, just say how sometimes it's like very arbitrary.
Right, but it suggests that their framers, understood that they were not listing everything that was protected. So the court is saying, in combination with the 14th and 9th, all of these things, there's a substantive, the liberty. They are using liberty in a very broad sense to talk about that, because if we do not have to accept the conservative interpretation, which says it has to be expressly written, certainly as African people, we would not limit ourselves to that. And they're not limiting themselves. They have said corporations are persons. Corporations have the ability to use money as free speech.
Wait a minute, what amendment are they establishing the personhood of corporations with?
They have usurped the 14th Amendment.
Wow.
And so
the amendment that Professor Porter just told us was passed to protect the rights of Black people. That's what they used to say corporations are people.
Right. And right above the liberty due process is the ideal that we have privileges and immunities, which they, with the slaughterhouse cases, read out in terms of protecting Black people to protect corporation. And so if we had to rely on express intent by the framers, then at that time, they never envisioned anybody but white men on the Supreme Court. They never envisioned Black people beyond being property. So if we're just limiting to that, we would be.
But this is actually, this is something both.
Make this point, Prof, and then we're going to come back after the break and continue this conversation. Make this last point here.
Right. I mean, but this is actually the problem with the court deciding anything, because the court is either going to be liberal or conservative. And so if the court is the body to decide what rights people have and don't have, that means potentially 5 people get to decide that. Mm-hmm. And right now is these 5 people. So there is a problem that people on all sides of the spectrum sort of agree about. And that is that it's better for more people to make the decision than 5. Because right now we're dealing with Alito, Thomas, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett.
A majority of whom were appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote. So that's absolutely right.
And 2 of them who are there because of stolen seats.
That's exactly
right. So that's why the legitimacy and credibility is shot. Because of the underhanded way the court got constituted. Otherwise, they would not even be in a position to make this decision.
To do this. Well, you know what? That's actually a perfect place to pause for a second. We'll pay some bills and come back on the other side, and we will continue the conversation about the text of the draft opinion, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, here at the Black Tape. Back in a moment.
Don't you think it's time to get wealthy? I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show on the Black Star Network focuses on the things your financial advisor or bank isn't telling you. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table. We're having our conversation with our legal round table, Professors Porter and Watkins, on the draft opinion, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And when we left, we were talking about the kind of assumptions that underlie much of jurisprudence in this country, and a lot is just being interpretation, and we don't have to accept the interpretations. In fact, I want to ask you all about this. Well, I'll make this statement, and I want to ask you another question. Professor Moyne, who I mentioned earlier, saying the courts are not your friend, he is also one of the people that says we should expand the number of justices on the court, and we've talked about that too. Perhaps even have one justice on the Supreme Court for every one of the federal Court of Appeal districts. I mean, that seems quite reasonable, but they've worked very hard to get to this moment. And let me ask a very specific question as it relates to the right to terminate a pregnancy relative to the other rights that you laid out, Professor Porter. And Alito mentions this in his draft opinion. He says this isn't contraception, this isn't interracial marriage, this isn't consensual sex and same sex. So why not? What makes this different, and why couldn't they just go after all of those other rights as well, since those rights are not enumerated in the letter of the federal Constitution?
Okay, so they do
are they protected by the 14th Amendment too? I mean, is it the same logic applied to them?
This is all 14th Amendment due process.
Okay.
But I would, that alarm is always going off in the background. Yes. I don't think this decision makes the alarm louder, because they do have a process for getting there. So they would have to, they made this case very narrow. They made this decision very narrow.
Yeah, because he says abortion relates to life. So I'm saying,
yes, and so due process guarantees the right to life, liberty, and property without, absent due process, absent, non-arbitrary procedures, absent arbitrary procedures. So he does make the distinction, and he does say, for the time being, I would read it as, for the time being, we're not messing with marriage, contraception, sexual intercourse decisions. But this is a very narrow decision about abortion. Now, the reason they get there is because they have created a test, and the test for implying fundamental rights in the Constitution is making it related to this idea of what is deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. Yeah, so abortion is an easy one to come after, because marriage, they can trace back to English common law. Autonomy and privacy in your house, they can trace back to English common law, what you do in your bedroom. But they're very specific about how abortion and the right to it cannot be traced back there. And he does that by going to 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, and looking at what laws are on the books, and looking at the tone of the country, and whether any states really thought it was a right. So that's how they get around that for now. I would add, though, that they can do whatever they want in the future, but it is very expressly narrow.
How do you reconcile this, Professor Watkins? You mentioned this earlier, and thank you, Professor Porter, for that's exactly like Zay as he lays it out. When Alito says that 28 of the 37 states that were in the Union by 1868, when the 14th Amendment was passed, outlawed abortion, how do you reconcile that with the experience of Black women, who for all but 3 of those years were enslaved? And of course you didn't want Black women terminating pregnancy, because every baby a Black woman had was like cash out of an ATM. So I'm trying to understand how Alito completely doesn't address that at all. He doesn't address race anywhere in the body, although he, in fact, it's almost an exquisite troll in the footnotes where he starts talking about stare decisis, which I would ask one of you to explain to the audience what stare decisis is, and says the stare decisis isn't in place at all time and all. And then he mentions Brown, and then he has a footnote where he just goes through the whole litany. Many of those cases are civil rights cases. But I mean, how is Black women, how can he talk about the historical roots, the history tradition in this country as a precedent for not preserving a woman's right to choose, when at the time of the 14th Amendment, Black women were without legal protection and hadn't been, at least up until the 14th Amendment?
Right. And that shows the weakness of the argument because they only are talking about certain groups of people. Like one of the things when he says send it back to the states, and he says, you know, when people are saying this is an attack on women's rights, he says women are not without electoral or political power, that the percentage of women who register to vote and cast ballots is consistently higher than the percentage of men. But yet we as Black people, Black women, have our rights to vote. You're basically facing de facto disenfranchisement with this whole entire scheme of voter suppression, voter nullification, all of the things that Professor Porter outlined. So when he's referencing certain things, he is definitely not taking into consideration the context explicitly of race and racism, but he is trolling because they're using Plessy versus Ferguson and the eugenics. For one of the things he tried to say, well, you all should be against, one of the conservative line is that you all should be against abortion because the eugenics movement was in favor of abortions and therefore you should be against it. But with that logic, I mean, people can want the same political outcome for different reasons.
In fact, let me mention here, just in context of that, in footnote 41, I was like, wow, you really going to try it? He says that it is beyond dispute that Roe has had the demographic effect of suppressing the Black population. I'm like, are you serious? Are we serious right now? But I mean, like he hit it in the footnote. He said, oh yeah. So he said people are making that argument. Oh yeah, no, the people who want to, who are pro-abortion, actually, some of them are against Black people. And you hear that argument in Black communities.
Right.
So help us unpack that a little bit in terms of what he's trying to do.
Well, what he's trying to do is that because this is such a departure, a radical departure from the operations of stare decisis and those types of, you know, the law is not supposed to just radically swing like this. And so he has to build this case to say this was so egregious, as he uses the term. And he's using the analogy with the white supremacist laws that gave us, separate but equal. But ironically, the very faction of the people that are doing this would be the people who would have been on this, if they had their way, would not have had the civil rights laws that were put in place. So it is really a deep trolling in many ways, because just like they said, oh, he's narrowing this in his opinion because to open it widely would just, cause total chaos. So this idea that we're not going to go after the other rights of privacy, he means right at this moment, as Professor Porter said, it's on the chopping block. And you know that because they trolled us in the Shelby County decision. Yes, we're undermining Section 4, which would be the formula that says which states are covered under the Voter Rights Act. Right. Mm-hmm. And they said, and you always had Section 2. But then not long ago, you had cases, at least 2, that attacked Section 2 of the Voter Rights Act. So it's even more weak and less protected. So yes, sometimes that's so Roberts told us they were not going to go after Section 2. And yet, what did they do? The very opposite thing. So the fact that he said they're not going to go after the other rights of privacy, just narrow it to Roe is just a placeholder. That's just for now.
Well, help us understand this as well. Either you, when you've been using the phrase stare decisis, what is stare decisis, and when do previous Supreme Court decisions have to be followed? Because Alito is saying here, he gives 5 reasons where he says, these are 5 factors that weigh strongly in overturning Roe and Casey. The nature of the error in those cases, the quality of reasoning in those cases, the workability of the rules they imposed on the country in those cases, the disruptive effect on other areas of the law in those cases, and the absence of concrete reliance. In other words, he is now revisiting the underlying logic of both Roe and Casey, when at least 3 of those justices, as you said, the stolen seat justices, are sitting there and told the Senate that Roe was decided law. So what is stare decisis then, and when do you have to follow previous precedents? Either of you?
Yeah, so stare decisis is this idea that you do honor precedent. You honor the earlier decisions of the court, even if the decisions are a little questionable, because of various reasons. Respect for the court, people understanding what the law is, being able to predict the law. And, you know, as Dr. Watkins said, the law isn't supposed to swing this way. You know, that sort of degrades trust in the judiciary. But it's not an absolute rule.
Clearly.
And we can take
we still be enslaved. we wouldn't be able to vote if it was that. I mean, so when can you overturn a previous line of cases?
The Plessy example of when you can overturn previous cases, that's a commonly raised example because it's the biggest one. Mm-hmm. But the court has done this before in other cases. There was a line of cases under substantive due process that was really about the court intervening with people's rights to contract and, you know, decide how long a work day was. That was called the Lochner line of cases. And they kind of turned around and said, okay, we're done with Lochner. So the court does do this periodically. And that 5-factor test that you outlined, Dr. Carr, that's a longstanding test. It's not like he's making the test up on the fly.
Right.
With all opinions, though, you know, they all sound good. They're all logical. They all apply tests. But it really does go back to the leanings of the justices. And I think this one is particularly stark, and people are seeing this really is a political game. And we don't trust the court anymore. We don't respect the court anymore. So all of the factors in the test that he enumerated about the court being distrusted, I think are going to come true. But it is, he's right. I mean, they do overrule precedent.
But you know what separates Plessy from this potential decision is that, again, Plessy was conferring equal protection under the law, equal rights. Yes. Whereas this decision is creating separate but unequal. It is taking away a constitutional right, which they have not done before. You know, technically, people say they've never taken away a right. I find that hard to take that absolute stand, because when we look at the 15th Amendment, although it's in some of these amendments with Black people, they're on the books, but they're not enforced. So technically, they have been taken away, even though they remain on paper.
Well, so, let's when we come back, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back, and that's actually a good place, Professor Watkins, for us to, when we return, explore. We've got one more block, and we want to look at the implications of this decision should it come out the way we've seen it lead. Back in a moment with the Black Table, Black Star Network.
We're all impacted by the culture, whether we know it or not. From politics to music and entertainment, it's a huge part of our lives, and we're going to talk about it every day right here on The Culture with me, Faraji Muhammad, only on the Black Star Network.
We're back at the Black Star Network with our legal roundtable, Professors Angela Porter and Valethia Watkins, discussing the Dobbs case, the leak draft opinion. Professor Watkins, when we left, you were talking about the fact that what distinguishes this potential decision from the others where you've seen overturning of previous lines of cases is that there is a reduction in the rights that folks have come to expect to be able to have. You know, as we look forward, how do you address folk who say, oh, well, this will just return it to the states, and that, you know, if you want to terminate a pregnancy, you can go to a state where, you know, that's legal and do that? I mean, what do you say to folks who would say that?
Well, you know, again, the flaw in that logic, if we had a just and fair voting system where Black people's rights and the rights of certain groups, our right to vote, our right to have our vote count, our right to have participation and representation, our right to not have our vote diluted with gerrymandering. If that system exists, maybe that would be an argument. But I also think there are certain fundamental rights that should not be subjected to the political whims of the electorate. If that's the case, that states' rights argument applies to those laws that overturned segregation. That's the whole argument of the South. States' right, let the people decide. There's certain basic human, fundamental constitutional rights that should not be subjected to the political process.
Well, Professor Ely made the point in his article that, of course, Alito leads with, that rights like that, the protecting the right to participate in the political process, those rights should be enshrined. But as we see here, this whole notion of leaving it to the legislatures, first of all, I mean, well, we know that in recent days, it's been reported that Senators Ernst and Langford are drafting legislation to try to get a federal ban on abortion. So as you said, this is, oh, leave it to the states. No, we know y'all not going to stop there. We know that much. But in terms of the legitimacy of the court, and Alito addresses that, although I thought it was interesting in another troll, he says that, you know, public opinion should not interfere with our judicial decision making. And then he puts in paren CF Brown versus Board of Education. And I was trying to figure out, was that a dig at critical race theory? I know, of course, for the viewing folks, CF contrafactual means, well, in this case, they actually allowed public opinion to weigh in. You know, does this undermine the legitimacy of the court in public opinion, Professor Porter? What do you think? I mean, does this have the potential to do that?
Yes, and I think the irony is that's the reasoning of this draft. So, because we don't trust the court, and honestly, I mean, this shows that the whole system is breaking. It's broken, it's ready to shatter, because we don't trust the courts, and I would argue we shouldn't, and we don't trust the legislature, and we probably shouldn't. And so for the court to say, don't trust 5 of us to make the decision on your rights, including creating the right, which the Roe Court did in 1973, including, you know, all the things that we do that should be at the legislature, and we can't trust the legislature, there's no element, there's no branch to trust. So it really just shows that the entire system of governance in this country makes no sense and is not even working the way that people profess it does. And I think it's a disingenuous conclusion for Alito and them to come to, because they know it doesn't work. So it's really to advance their agenda. They're hiding behind a truth, which is, don't trust us to make decisions about your fundamental rights. And unless they're expressly in the Constitution, that's the argument.
But even if they are expressly in the okay, so let's look forward then. We know that Roe relies on, among other things, Griswold versus Connecticut. We know that there's no explicit right to privacy, and you've talked about the penumbras. You talked about the source of those amendments, whether it be 1, 3, 4, 9, or 14. You know, what do you see coming forward? Both of you have implied that none of those rights that are not enumerated in the Constitution are safe. What does this mean for Black people listening to this?
It does mean that they're not safe. I would say, like Dr. Watkins said, like I said earlier, they this is a narrow opinion, but it doesn't mean in the future, with future cases involving marriage, with future cases involving sexual intercourse, involving contraception.
You don't mean interracial marriage. I mean, that's legal. I mean, it's always going to be legal, right?
That's on
that right is in the Constitution.
Too.
Wait, what?
No,
that's on the chopping block too.
No, wait, y'all
has been open. This is a truly
people watching this, and they rely on a standard of excellence. Now they rely on your expertise. Certainly, interracial marriage could not. It's not.
This is truly a comprehensive war on rights. It really is. And so for Black people, we have to broaden the lens. We have to connect the dots. We can't just put it in a men versus women frame. We can't just say this is just a war on women. This is a war on women and the Black communities and other communities they are involved in. And the other reason that men versus women framing is oversimplified and problematic is because it lets conservative women off the hook in terms of being accountable. Because without them putting Trump in office, 53% of them voted for Trump. Their support of the GOP and this conservative push to overturn overturn Roe. Their support of the Republican Party is what keeps the party in power. So there are men and women on both sides. There are men who are standing up against this decision. So we have to broaden it out as Black people to a broader sense of this war on other people who are non-white and pro-white supremacy.
So then help me with this, because and this is something we don't have a lot of time today. And of course, the next time we come back, we might, and of course, the decision hasn't been made. So we'll have this, and we don't know why it was leaked. It may have been leaked to get this point so they can workshop it, to see where they may have to machine some of the language. But why are women a protected class? I mean, Black folk are, but certainly this couldn't be reduced to one footnote in one case, right? I mean, why aren't women a protected class? Alito talks about the fact that this isn't just about sex. You've also got to have animus. It's got to be deliberate. And why don't women fit in the kind of category of a protected class, or do they? That's poor.
Well, okay, so now we're in another discussion, and that's the Equal Protection Clause, which Alito comes to at the end of the draft opinion. And no, the reason I think women are not seen as a protected class in the law goes back to what Dr. Watkins just said. You're looking for protected classes, you're looking for discrete and insular minorities and people who have, who are specifically subject to being oppressed. And women do have power. So that's part of the breaking of the narrative. White women have power. Conservative white women have power. Slave owners who were white women had power historically. So, that's not the same as Black people who have been oppressed and literally enslaved. And in the 14th Amendment, which is the vehicle for creating some of these rights, was meant to protect. So it's just a different history. It's not the same history or narrative.
Thank you, Professor Porter. And Professor Watkins, even as we realize that 1 in 4 women in this country are likely to have an abortion at some point in their lives, and that of those women who will terminate a pregnancy, they're more likely to be unmarried, to be in their 20s, to be low income, to perhaps always to have already had a child, and to be Black. What will you say to folk who are now terrified that their options will be reduced, if not eliminated, by this case and the things that follow in the wake?
Well, we have to look at our history and understand we always have the power as people if we organize, if we come together. Nothing has ever been easy for us. As they said, life has not been a crystal stair. There are organizations that are trying to create workarounds. So there are people who are creating resources to try to be there to address people. They have a right to be concerned. But, this is a long-term struggle. It has been a long-term struggle for us to gain our freedoms that we've got, the little rights that we do have. And look at the other side. This is a harvest, a season of harvest for them. Seeds that they planted 50 years ago.
Yes.
To get to this point. And so we can do no less. We have to do more. And so it's to have that vision for the world we want to bring into existence and to fight for it. We're going to have to fight for it. And so we are a generation of people who have never existed in the world without this fundamental constitutional protection.
That's true.
It's an abrupt swing, but we can change it and create the world we want. We just got to get organized, get connected, and fight.
Thank you, Professor Watkins. And Professor Porter, you saying one of those places we should train our eyes on next in the wake of this will be the legislatures?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where this fight now has to migrate, is to the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
And
including the federal legislature. They can't take the federal legislature.
Congress.
Including
Congress. But if you haven't been attentive to those elections, this is the time. State elections, congressional elections. And we need to do the work to educate our people about how the system really works, and continue to watch the court as well.
Thank you. Well, we're going to pause here for now. We'll reconvene our legal roundtable shortly in the near future to continue to have these conversations. Congratulations to both of your all of your students who are graduating. This is the season of graduation, and we'll now release you so you can go back and finish grading, because we know it's also grading and come to the mercy seat time for academics all over the country. So with that, thank you, Professor Angela Porter and Professor Lethea Watkins, for joining us on such short notice to help walk us through this case and its implications. We'll be back in a moment. Oh, of course. We'll be back in a moment and clear the table for next week. Back on the Black Star Network at the Black Table.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
Welcome back to the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr, your host here on the Black Star Network. And hopefully what we've all just participated in and what you just heard will help us understand the severity of the times we face as it relates to the Supreme Court and decisions being made. And what we heard from Professor Porter and Professor Watkins there at the end really put it, as Joe Madison would say, where the goats could get it. In fact, let's end today thinking about something Professor Watkins said about the fact that we've always had to fight, with a quote from the 1930s. The man who is widely known as the man who killed Jim Crow, the vice dean of Howard University School of Law, the trainer of Thurgood Marshall, the man who was present for Pauli Murray and Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill and so many others, the great Charles Hamilton Houston. In the March 1936 issue of the Crisis magazine, as they were fighting for voting rights and against restricted covenants and fighting to get folk admitted into schools, Charlie Houston wrote an op-ed in the Crisis magazine entitled "Don't Shout Too Soon." Charles Hamilton Houston said at that time, "Lawsuits mean little unless supported by public opinion. Nobody needs to explain to a Negro the difference between the law in the books and the law in action. The really baffling problem is how to create the proper kind of public opinion." So our work's cut out for us, and we will act accordingly. See you next week, back at the Black Table here on the Black Star Network.